For 5 long years, I hated Victoria Sterling. When she abandoned me, she left nothing but a 3-line note. But today, she didn't just walk back into my life, she walked into my boardroom as my ruthless new boss. And before I could hand in my resignation, she locked the heavy double doors behind us, trapped me against the wall, and finally whispered the real, terrifying reason she actually left. The rain in Manhattan never just falls. It slaps against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 32nd floor like a warning. I stared at my reflection in the polished mahogany of the conference table, adjusting my tortoiseshell glasses to hide the exhaustion behind them. Everyone in the room was whispering, their voices a low, anxious hum that set my teeth on edge. The board had called an emergency meeting at 8 in the morning, which only ever meant one of 2 things: a massive layoff or a new tyrant. "Let's be real here," I muttered to Marcus, the head of marketing sitting next to me. "If they cut our creative budget again, I'm launching my coffee mug through that window." Marcus didn't laugh. He just chewed on the end of his pen, his eyes glued to the empty leather chair at the head of the table. That chair belonged to the Chief Operating Officer, a position that had been mysteriously vacant for exactly 48 hours. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open, and the idle chatter vanished instantly, swallowed by a sudden, heavy silence. Our CEO, Arthur Vance, no relation to me, just a man who shared my last name and possessed a terrifying amount of real estate, stepped in first. He didn't take his usual seat. Instead, he stood to the side, gesturing toward the hallway with a rare, deferential smile. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Arthur announced, his voice booming across the room. "As you know, Hearst Media Group is entering a phase of aggressive restructuring." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my oversized blazer, bracing myself for the corporate speech. "To lead this transition, the board has appointed a new chief operating officer," Arthur continued, looking toward the door. "She comes to us straight from the London office, where she revived their entire digital sector in less than 18 months. A woman stepped through the threshold, and the air left my lungs so fast it felt like a physical blow. It was the hair first, a flawless, platinum blonde low bun that didn't have a single strand out of place despite the New York storm outside. Then came the charcoal suit, tailored so sharply it looked like armor, moving with a calculated, effortless grace. But it was the eyes that stopped the clock completely, a piercing, familiar ice blue that I hadn't seen in exactly 5 long years. Victoria Sterling. The ceramic rim of my coffee mug burned against my palm, but I couldn't move, couldn't blink, couldn't even breathe. A faint, unmistakable scent drifted across the room, cutting through the smell of stale catered pastries and old paper. Sandalwood and rain. It was the exact same fragrance that used to linger on my bedsheets. The same scent I spent months trying to wash out of my life after she walked away. Victoria didn't look at the room. She looked at the tablet in her hand, her sharp jawline tight as she tapped the screen once. "Good morning," she said. Her voice hadn't changed at all, soft-spoken, cool, yet carrying a weight that forced every single person in the room to sit up straighter. She finally raised her eyes, scanning the long table with a slow, deliberate gaze that felt like a temperature drop. When her eyes reached the middle of the table, they stopped. She looked directly at me. There was no shock in her expression, no flicker of recognition, not even a tightening of her lips. It was like looking at a stranger, or worse, looking at a ghost that didn't care it was dead. "I've spent the last 12 hours reviewing the Q3 performance metrics for every department in this room," Victoria said, her gaze lingering on me for 1 second too long before moving back to Arthur. "And to be frank, the numbers aren't acceptable," she added quietly. A collective, silent flinch rippled through the senior staff, but I kept my chin up, forcing my face into a mask of pure professional indifference. 5 years ago, she had left New York without a backward glance, leaving nothing but a key on the kitchen counter and a void in my chest. Now, she was standing less than 10 feet away, holding the fate of my entire career in her manicured hands. Victoria took her seat at the head of the table, smoothly opening a leather-bound folder. "We are going to change the way Hearst operates, starting today," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. "There will be no more indulgence for creative projects that do not yield direct revenue." I felt the blood rush to my ears, the guarded walls I had built over half a decade suddenly threatening to crack. "The creative department has been the backbone of our digital engagement for the last 3 quarters, Miss Sterling," I said. The words left my mouth before I could stop them, sharp and entirely too loud in the quiet room. Marcus nudged my foot under the table, a silent plea for me to shut up, but I kept my eyes locked on the new COO. Victoria slowly raised her head, her ice-blue eyes fixing on me with the calm precision of a predator watching a minor inconvenience. She didn't interrupt me. She just waited, letting the silence pressure me until the echo of my own voice felt awkward. "Engagement doesn't pay the shareholders, Ms. Vance," Victoria said, her tone perfectly even, completely devoid of any personal history. Hearing her say my name with that icy professionalism felt like a bucket of freezing water poured down my spine. "Data pays the shareholders," she continued, leaning forward slightly, resting her forearms on the mahogany table. "And currently, your department is spending 40% more than it returns. Because quality journalism and design require resources," I replied, my voice tighter now, my fingers gripping my pen until my knuckles turned white. "We aren't a factory assembly line." Victoria didn't blink. "You are whatever the balance sheet requires you to be," she said softly. The room was so quiet you could hear the rain drumming against the glass pane behind her. Arthur Vance cleared his throat, sensing the sudden, inexplicable spike in the room's atmospheric pressure. "Well, Victoria has the full backing of the board to make these calls," Arthur said, trying to smooth over the tension. "I suggest every department head prepares a comprehensive budget review by Friday." Victoria closed her folder with a soft, decisive snap. "That will be all for now," she said, standing up. "Except for the creative director." My heart did a violent twist against my ribs, though my face remained completely still. The rest of the board members began gathering their laptops and papers, moving with an urgency that suggested they wanted to escape the blast radius. Marcus gave me a sympathetic, terrified look as he stood up, whispering, "Good luck," before practically sprinting out the door. Within 90 seconds, the massive boardroom was entirely empty, save for the 2 of us. Victoria stood by the window, her back turned to me as she watched the gray New York skyline, the charcoal fabric of her suit catching the dim light. I stood up slowly, smoothing down my blazer, determined not to let her see the tremor in my hands. "If this is about the budget, Ms. Sterling, I can have the modified projections on your desk by tomorrow," I said, keeping my tone strictly corporate. Victoria didn't answer immediately. She turned around slowly, her movements unhurried, her gaze tracking me as I walked toward the edge of the table. The strict, untouchable COO seemed to fade just a fraction, replaced by something much more dangerous. The woman who knew exactly how I took my coffee and exactly how to break me. She walked over to the heavy double doors, reached out, and turned the lock with a distinct metallic click. Then she turned back to me, her ice-blue eyes darkening as she stepped into my personal space. "5 years, Elena," she murmured, her voice dropping the corporate mask entirely, turning low and dangerously intimate. "And that's the first thing you say to me?" The click of the lock sounded like a gunshot in the empty room. I stayed exactly where I was, my heels dug into the carpet, refusing to give her the satisfaction of taking a step back. Victoria turned around smoothly, the silver key disappearing into the pocket of her tailored trousers. She walked back toward me with that same measured, terrifying elegance that had once made me lose my mind. "You haven't changed your perfume," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a low, smoky register that was never meant for a boardroom. "Or the way you cross your arms when you feel cornered." The sandalwood scent was closer now, wrapping around me, threatening to choke out the reality of the last 5 years. I forced a dry, humorless laugh, tilting my head slightly to look her dead in the eye. "Let's be real here, Ms. Sterling," I said, my voice steady despite the sudden spike of adrenaline. "Locked doors don't look good on your first day, especially with a subordinate." Victoria stopped just 2 feet away, close enough for me to see the tiny flecks of silver in her ice-blue eyes. She didn't look angry, she looked amused, her gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before returning to my eyes. "Subordinate," she repeated, testing the word on her tongue as if it were a strange new wine. "Is that what we are now, Elena?" "That's exactly what we are," I said, my fingers clenching into fists inside the pockets of my oversized blazer. "You are the COO of Hearst Media. I am the creative director. Anything else expired half a decade ago." Victoria leaned against the edge of the mahogany table, crossing her own arms, perfectly mimicking my defensive posture. The proximity was suffocating, bringing back vivid, unbidden memories of a tiny apartment in Brooklyn and rainy mornings that looked just like this one. "Expiring implies it died a natural death," Victoria said softly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "We both know that's not what happened." "Right, you slaughtered it," I snapped, the professional veneer cracking for just a second, letting the old, raw bitterness leak out. "You walked out the door to catch a flight to London while I was out buying groceries, Victoria. You don't get to come back 5 years later and play the nostalgic ex." For the first time since she entered the room, Victoria's composure faltered, her jaw tightening just a fraction. But it passed so quickly I almost thought I imagined it, replaced instantly by that cold, unreadable mask. "I did what was required for my career, and for my family," she said, her voice dropping a few decibels, carrying a quiet, dangerous weight. "I don't expect you to understand the pressure I was under." "I don't need to understand it because it's none of my business anymore," I said, stepping past her toward the exit. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a creative team to manage." I reached for the handle of the double doors, but before my fingers could touch the metal, her hand snapped out. Victoria pressed her palm against the wood right above my shoulder, her body closing the distance between us until I could feel the heat radiating from her suit. She didn't touch me. She knew the rules of the building as well as I did, but she didn't have to. Her shadow completely engulfed me, locking me between the hard wood of the door and the absolute authority of her presence. "I am not done speaking to you, Miss Vance," she whispered, her breath brushing against the side of my neck, making the hairs there stand on end. I froze, my back to her, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Let go of the door, Victoria," I said, refusing to turn around and face how close she really was. "You want to talk about the budget?" Victoria murmured, ignoring my request entirely. "Let's talk about it. Your Q3 numbers are romantic, Elena. You're chasing art in a house built for commerce." "Art is what keeps our subscribers from deleting the app," I retorted, my teeth gritted. "Perhaps," Victoria said, her hands still resting firmly against the door, keeping me trapped. "But I am the one who signs the checks now. If I decide your department is dead weight, it vanishes, along with your team." A cold dread settled in my stomach, replacing the anger with a grim, professional reality. She wasn't just my ex-girlfriend anymore. She was the executioner, and she had just reminded me exactly how much power she held over my life. I turned around slowly, forcing my back against the door, bringing us chest to chest, our faces only inches apart. Her ice blue eyes were dark, intense, swirling with a mixture of professional ruthlessness and something entirely too personal. "Are you threatening my staff to get back at me?" I demanded, my voice a harsh whisper. "Is that how low you've crawled?" Victoria's gaze softened just a fraction, her eyes tracing the sharp line of my jaw, her expression turning almost regretful. "I don't mix business with personal vendettas, Elena. I never have," she said quietly. "If our work is flawless, it stays. If it isn't, it goes. It's that simple." "Then let me go back to my desk and fix it," I said, looking down at her hand on the door. Victoria didn't move her hand. Instead, she leaned in slightly closer, the scent of sandalwood and rain completely overwhelming my senses. "The current proposal you submitted to Arthur is garbage," she said, her tone perfectly conversational, yet entirely commanding. "I want a complete rewrite, every dollar justified, every creative asset quantified." "I told you. I'll have the projections on your desk by Friday morning," I said, trying to maintain my boundary. "No," Victoria said softly, a ghost of a smile touching the corner of her lips, a cold, beautiful smile that sent a shiver straight down my spine. "Friday is for the board. I want it tonight." I stared at her, disbelieving. "Tonight? It's already 9 a.m., Victoria. A full restructure proposal takes days." "Then I suggest you get started," she replied, finally lowering her hand from the door, stepping back to give me space. She walked back to her leather chair at the head of the table, picking up her tablet with a smooth, dismissive gesture. "Bring the new draft to my office at 8 p.m., Victoria added without looking up from the screen. "After the rest of the floor has gone home. We will go through it line by line." "And if I refuse?" I asked, my hand gripping the doorknob, which was now unlocked. Victoria paused, her thumb hovering over the glass screen of her tablet, her eyes rising to meet mine one last time. "Then you can hand in your resignation along with the old budget," she said, her voice soft, polite, and completely devoid of mercy. "The choice is yours, creative director." I didn't give her another word. I turned the handle, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the bright, buzzing hallway of the 32nd floor. My hands were shaking so badly I had to bury them deep inside my pockets as I walked past the curious stares of my colleagues. 8 o'clock. An empty office floor, a complete rewrite, and a woman who held my entire future in her hands, waiting for me in the dark. I walked back into the creative department with my head held high, though my pulse was drumming a frantic rhythm against my collarbone. The open-plan office was buzzing like a disturbed beehive, every designer and copywriter staring at their screens with performative focus. Marcus caught my eye the moment I passed the water cooler, dropping a stack of notebooks to trail behind me into my glass-walled office. "What happened?" he whispered the second the door clicked shut. "Did the Ice Queen chop off your head? Or are we all getting shipped to a warehouse in New Jersey?" I sat down at my desk, pulling my laptop open with a force that made the screen shudder. "Let's be real here, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "She wants blood, but she's willing to settle for a total restructure first." Marcus groaned, running a hand over his face. "A restructure? Elena. We spent 3 months onboarding those freelance animators for the winter campaign. Then we have exactly 9 hours to prove why those animators are worth every cent of their retainer," I said, looking him dead in the eye. I didn't tell him about the locked door or the scent of sandalwood that still felt trapped under my skin. I didn't tell him that the woman holding the guillotine over our department used to sleep with her head on my chest. "Gather the team," I ordered, pulling up the master spreadsheet. "I want every single metric of engagement from the past 6 months translated into dollar amounts by noon." For the next 4 hours, my office turned into a war room. We ordered 3 boxes of lukewarm pizza that nobody really ate, the grease smudging the edges of our printed spreadsheets. I watched my team argue over conversion words and click through margins, their anxiety fueling a desperate, brilliant kind of energy. Every time my eyes wandered to the ceiling, I remembered that 3 floors above us, Victoria was likely doing the exact same thing. She was analyzing us, reducing our late nights and creative breakthroughs into cold, indifferent rows of black and red ink. By 4 in the afternoon, the storm outside had settled into a miserable, persistent drizzle that blurred the neon signs of Times Square. The creative team began to disperse, exhausted but satisfied with the defense strategy we had built on paper. Marcus stayed back for a moment, stacking the empty pizza boxes by the recycle bin. "You look like you're preparing for a trial, Elena," he said, studying my face with genuine concern. "Don't let her get under your skin. She's just corporate muscle." "I'm fine," I said, offering him a tight, reassuring smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Go home, Marcus. I'll handle the final review." Once the door closed behind him, the silence of the room descended like a heavy blanket. I leaned back in my chair, taking off my tortoiseshell glasses to rub the bridge of my nose, staring at the flashing cursor on my screen. 5 years ago, Victoria hadn't been an untouchable corporate executioner in a 3-piece suit. She had been a brilliant, fiercely ambitious graduate student who used to burn her toast and laugh until she couldn't breathe in the kitchen of our cramped apartment. We had shared everything: cheap bottles of wine, dreams of conquering the New York media scene, and promises whispered in the dark. But ambition is a quiet poison. It doesn't kill all at once. It just slowly replaces the blood in your veins until you're made of stone. When the London offer came, she didn't ask me to go with her, nor did she ask me to wait. She simply chose the empire over the apartment, leaving a brief, polite note on the counter that read like a corporate memo. "The pressure from the family estate is too great. I cannot carry this and carry us. Forgive me." I laughed out loud in the empty office, the sound hollow and sharp. Now she was back, pretending the past was nothing but bad data on a balance sheet. By 7:30, the entire 32nd floor was completely dark, save for the fluorescent glow of my own desk lamp. The cleaning crew moved down the hallway, the rhythmic whir of their vacuum cleaner the only sign of life left in the building. I stood up, smoothing down the wrinkles in my oversized blazer, and gathered my tablet along with the newly bound budget proposal. My fingers were cold. I walked out to the elevator bank, the silence of the empty corridor amplifying the sharp click of my heels against the terrazzo floor. I pressed the button for the 35th floor, the executive suite, and watched the numbers light up in the reflective chrome of the elevator doors. The elevator rose smoothly, a soft chime announcing my arrival at the top of the food chain. The executive floor was different from mine. The air smelled cleaner. The carpets were thicker, swallowing the sound of my footsteps entirely. The glass walls of the corner office revealed a sprawling view of the Manhattan skyline, a glittering sea of lights fighting against the rainy dark. Victoria's office door was heavy oak, left slightly ajar, a single bars of warm yellow light cutting across the dim hallway floor. I stopped at the threshold, my hand hovering over the wood, taking one deep breath to lock away every emotion I possessed. "Come in, Elena." Her voice drifted out before I could even knock. She didn't look up from her desk as I pushed the door open, her platinum blonde bun catching the light of her desk lamp. She had taken off her suit jacket, revealing a crisp silk blouse, the sleeves rolled up just past her wrists, exposing the pale skin of her forearms. The scent of sandalwood and rain was overwhelming in the enclosed space, far more concentrated than it had been at the boardroom. "You're exactly on time," Victoria said, finally raising her ice-blue eyes to meet mine. She gestured toward the minimalist leather chair directly across from her desk, her expression perfectly unreadable. "Let's see if you've wasted my day, or saved your own." I didn't sit down immediately. Instead, I stepped up to the edge of her glass desk and slid the newly printed leather-bound proposal across the polished surface. Victoria didn't reach for it right away. Her eyes remained fixed on my face, tracing the dark circles under my eyes with unsettling slowness. "Sit, Elena," she murmured, her voice carrying that quiet, absolute authority that made my spine go rigid. "We have a lot of numbers to kill tonight." I pulled back the heavy leather chair, sitting on the very edge of it, keeping my posture as stiff as a soldier in a trench. "Let's be real here, Miss Sterling," I said, leaning forward and opening my own tablet. "Every dollar in that document is backed by 3 months of solid consumer data." Victoria finally picked up the proposal, her long manicured fingers flipping the first page with a soft, deliberate rustle. The warm light of the desk lamp caught the sharp angle of her jaw, highlighting the absolute perfection of her profile. "Page 4, she said, her voice dropping into a cool, analytical rhythm. "You've increased the budget for external freelance designers by 15%. Because our intern team is already running on 60-hour weeks to meet the holiday deadline," I countered, keeping my tone perfectly level. Victoria turned the page, her ice-blue eyes scanning the columns of text without a single flicker of emotion. "An inefficient timeline is a management failure, not a financial justification," she said softly, not even looking up at me. "It's not an efficiency. It's the creative process," I snapped, my fingers tightening around the edge of my tablet. "You can't just press a button and expect a viral marketing campaign to appear out of thin air." Victoria stopped reading, slowly lowering the document to the desk, her gaze rising to meet mine with the weight of a collapsing star. "A creative process that bankrupts the quarter is a luxury Hearst cannot afford," she said, leaning forward just an inch. The scent of sandalwood and rain drifted across the small gap between us, thick and heavy in the enclosed office air. I felt a sudden, familiar heat rising in my chest, the exact same frustration I used to feel when we argued in our kitchen 5 years ago. She had always been the logic to my passion, the cold water to my fire, and it infuriated me how easily she could step back into that role. "Look at the projection chart on page 7, I said, standing up and leaning over her desk to tap the paper manually. "If we cut those freelancers now, our engagement drops by 20% by November, which means losing the Mercedes-Benz sponsorship." Because I was leaning forward, my face was suddenly less than a foot away from hers, the boundary I had spent all day building instantly dissolving. I could see the faint, dark violet shadows under her ice-blue eyes, a subtle hint that she wasn't sleeping any better than I was. Victoria didn't move away. She looked down at my hand resting on the desk, right next to her own. Her breathing shifted, growing just a fraction deeper, a small sound that seemed incredibly loud in the empty executive suite. "Your logic is sound, Elena," she whispered, her voice losing its sharp corporate edge, turning low and dangerously soft. "But your execution is reckless." "It's called taking a calculated risk," I whispered back, refusing to pull away, refusing to let her see me flinch. Victoria slowly reached out, her fingers wrapping around the sleek silver fountain pen resting on her blotter. As she lifted it, the side of her hand brushed against mine, a brief, deliberate sweep of warm skin against my knuckles. A sharp electric shock traveled straight up my arm, making my breath catch in my throat before I could stop it. I froze, staring at her fingers, memories of those same hands tracing my skin in the dark, flooding my mind with terrifying vividness. Victoria didn't let go of the tension. She kept her hand resting just millimeters away from mine, the heat radiating between us like a physical wire. "You always did fight hardest when you were backed into a corner," she murmured, her ice-blue eyes darkening as she looked up through her lashes. "Don't do that," I said, my voice shaking slightly as I finally pulled my hand back, stepping away from the desk. "Don't talk about the past." Victoria stood up slowly, her tall, slender frame moving with that effortless elegance that always made her look like she owned the room. She walked around the desk, stopping just outside my personal space, her silk blouse shifting slightly against her shoulders. "The past is the only reason you're still sitting in this office, Elena," she said quietly, her voice entirely serious now. I stared at her, my heart doing a violent twist against my ribs. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means Arthur wanted to fire you this morning to save the budget," Victoria said, crossing her arms over her chest. "I told him your department was essential." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, leaving me temporarily speechless as I tried to process the hidden politics of the morning. She hadn't come here to execute me. She had stepped in as a shield, though she had made me bleed for it anyway. "I don't need your charity, Victoria," I said, my voice tight with a mixture of pride and confusion. "It's not charity, it's an investment," she replied, her eyes locked onto mine. "But investments require absolute loyalty and absolute control." She stepped closer, forcing me to tilt my head up to maintain eye contact, the proximity turning suffocating once again. "There is a major loophole in this proposal," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a low, commanding murmur. "You need the Mercedes-Benz contract to back these numbers, but the contract hasn't been signed yet." "We are finalizing the terms next week," I said, defending my ground. "Next week is too late," Victoria said, a cold, beautiful smile touching her lips. "The CEO of their North American division is hosting a private gala at the Plaza Hotel tomorrow night." She reached into her pocket, pulling out a sleek, matte black invitation card and sliding it onto the desk. "I am attending as the representative for Hearst," she continued, her ice blue eyes trapping mine. "And you are coming with me as my personal creative strategist." I stared at the black card, a sudden sense of dread washing over me. "A private gala? That's outside my job description." "Your job description is whatever I need it to be to save this company," Victoria said softly, leaning in until her breath brushed my cheek. "We will pitch him together, Elena, and if we win the account, your budget stays exactly as it is." "And if we lose?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the dark room. Victoria leaned back, her expression turning into that unreadable, icy mask once again as she picked up her jacket. "Then you will help me dismantle your department piece by piece," she said politely. "I will see you in the lobby at 7 p.m. tomorrow. Dress appropriately." The black silk of the tailored suit felt like a second skin, far tighter than my usual oversized blazers. I stared at my reflection in the full-length mirror of the apartment, swapping my tortoiseshell glasses for contacts and breathing out a long, heavy sigh. "Let's be real here, Elena," I muttered to the empty room. "You are walking into a lion's den, and you paid for the privilege." The taxi dropped me off under the grand canopy of the Plaza Hotel at exactly 10 minutes to 7. The rain had returned, turning Fifth Avenue into a blurred canvas of yellow headlights and shimmering gray asphalt. I stepped into the gilded warmth of the lobby, the crystal chandeliers above reflecting off the polished marble fleers like thousands of tiny stars. Standing near the grand staircase was Victoria, and the sight of her nearly made my feet glue themselves to the floor. She wasn't wearing her usual corporate armor today. Instead, she wore a structured, floor-length midnight blue gown that exposed the elegant line of her collarbones. Her platinum blonde hair was styled in soft, vintage waves that framed her sharp jawline perfectly, catching the warm light of the lobby. She held a crystal glass of champagne in one hand, her ice blue eyes scanning the crowd with a look of supreme, effortless boredom. The moment I stepped closer, her gaze snapped directly to me, tracking my approach with an intensity that made the air feel suddenly thin. "You're late by 2 minutes," Victoria said softly, though the look in her eyes told a completely different story. "The traffic on the west side was a nightmare, Miss Sterling," I replied, smoothing down the lapels of my jacket. Victoria set her champagne glass down on a passing waiter's tray, her gaze dropping to trace the fitted silhouette of my suit. "The suit suits you," she murmured, her voice dropping to that low, smoky register that always bypassed my defenses. "Though I always preferred you in softer fabrics." "We are here for data and contracts, remember?" I said, forcing my voice to remain perfectly professional. Victoria didn't answer. She simply stepped closer, her hand reaching out to brush a stray piece of lint off my shoulder. Her fingers lingered for a fraction of a second against the fabric, the faint scent of sandalwood and rain immediately enveloping me. The Mercedes-Benz executive, Klaus Reinhardt, is already in the main ballroom, she whispered, her breath brushing my ear. Play your part, Elena. Before I could ask what she meant, she smoothly slid her arm through mine, her fingers locking firmly around my forearm. The physical contact was an immediate jolt, but I kept my chin up as she guided me into the roaring sea of New York's elite. The grand ballroom was a blur of diamonds, tuxedos, and the low, aristocratic hum of old money laughing at private jokes. Victoria moved through the crowd like a monarch, her grip on my arm never loosening, anchoring me directly to her side. Whenever a wealthy investor tried to steer the conversation away from business, Victoria would seamlessly pull me into the circle. My creative director, Elena Vance, has designed the entire digital rollout specifically around your brand's heritage, Victoria told Klaus Reinhardt, a tall, imposing man with sharp gray hair. I stepped in on cue, breaking down our conversion metrics and target demographics with a precision that had Klaus nodding in genuine approval. For 45 minutes, we were a flawless machine, my passion and data perfectly balanced by Victoria's commanding corporate authority. I must say, Miss Sterling, your team is highly impressive, Klaus smiled, raising his glass toward us. Let my office know your terms by Monday morning. As Klaus walked away, I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding all day, a genuine smile breaking across my face. We did it, I whispered, turning to Victoria, briefly forgetting the wall between us. We actually got the contract. Victoria was looking down at me, the coldness in her ice-blue eyes completely replaced by a dark, burning warmth that made my heart stutter. I told you, Elena, she murmured, her thumb lightly tracing the inner wrist of my arm, right where my pulse was jumping. You are brilliant when you are pushed. Before I could process the sudden tenderness, a young, handsome man in a bespoke tuxedo stepped into our space holding 2 fresh glasses of wine. Pardon the interruption, ladies, but I couldn't help but notice the finest creative mind in Manhattan standing here, he said, offering a charming smile directly to me. He completely ignored Victoria, stepping between us to hand me a glass, his eyes lingering on my collarbone. I'm Julian, from the Vanguard Group, he continued, leaning in entirely too close to my personal space. I'd love to discuss a few creative consulting roles over dinner sometime. Elena. I felt a sudden drop in the room's temperature, the atmospheric pressure spiking instantly. Victoria didn't move, but her posture went entirely rigid, her ice-blue eyes narrowing into twin slivers of absolute frost. Ms. Vance is under an exclusive executive contract with Hearst Media, Julian, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet, venomous level. Julian laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. Surely a dinner to discuss future options doesn't violate a contract, Miss Sterling. Victoria took a single step forward, completely cutting Julian off from me, her tall frame radiating a silent, suffocating dominance. She doesn't have future options outside of my corporation, Victoria said, her tone carrying a quiet, possessive weight that made my jaw drop. Good evening. Julian blinked, his face turning pale under the sheer weight of her authority, before he muttered an excuse and vanished into the crowd. I stared at Victoria's back, a mix of shock and sudden furious adrenaline rushing through my veins. What the hell was that? I hissed under my breath, grabbing her wrist and pulling her away from the center of the ballroom. Victoria didn't say a word. She gripped my hand back, her fingers crushing mine as she led me toward the heavy glass doors of the conservatory terrace. She pushed the doors open, pulling me out into the cool, dark night air, away from the music and the prying eyes of the elite. The terrace was empty, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm against the glass roof above us, the city lights reflecting in the puddles on the stone floor. Victoria turned around, slang her hand against the brick wall right next to my head, trapping me instantly within her shadow. Her breathing was heavy, her chest rising and falling sharply, the untouchable COO mask completely shattered into pieces. "You don't look at other people like that, Elena," she whispered fiercely, her ice-blue eyes wild and dangerously dark in the dim light. "You don't let them touch you." "Let's be real here, Victoria," I yelled back, my hands pressing against her shoulders to push her away, though she didn't budge an inch. "You don't own me. You walked away 5 years ago, remember?" "I had to leave," she choked out, her face losing all its color, her fingers gripping the lapels of my suit jacket with a desperate, trembling force. "But I never stopped looking for you," she whispered, her forehead coming down to rest against mine, her breath shaking against my lips. "I bought this company because you were here." The confession left me completely paralyzed, my heart hammering so violently against my ribs I thought it would break. Victoria's grip tightened, her lips hovering just millimeters from mine. The sheer, agonizing tension between us stretched to the absolute breaking point. Right as her lips brushed mine, the heavy glass doors of the terrace swung open behind us, a bright beam of light cutting through the dark. "Victoria? Elena?" Klaus Reinhardt's voice boomed out into the rainy air. "Are you two out here?" The sound of Klaus's voice hit us like a bucket of ice water. Victoria didn't flinch, but the violent tremor in her fingers as she let go of my jacket told me everything. In the span of a single heartbeat, the desperate, trembling woman vanished, swallowed whole by the immaculate armor of Victoria Sterling, Chief Operating Officer. She stepped away from me smoothly, her midnight blue gown swirling around her ankles as she turned toward the light. "We are right here, Klaus," Victoria said, her voice perfectly level, completely devoid of the raw emotion that had just shaken the air. I stayed in the shadow of the brick wall for a second longer, smoothing down my suit jacket and forcing my frantic breathing to slow down. "Ah, excellent," Klaus smiled, stepping onto the terrace with a cigar between his fingers. I was worried the New York rain had driven my favorite strategists away. I forced myself into the light, offering a polite, practiced smile that felt completely hollow on my face. "Just taking in the view, Mr. Reinhardt," I said, my voice only slightly tight. "The skyline looks different when you've just secured a major partnership." Klaus chuckled, his eyes moving between the two of us with a look of shrewd appreciation. "The synergy between you two is quite remarkable," he noted, taking a slow puff of his cigar. "Hearst Media is in very capable, very fierce hands." "We don't believe in losing opportunities, Klaus," Victoria replied, her ice-blue eyes reflecting the distant city lights. She didn't look back at me, but her hand found the small of my back, her palm pressing firmly through the sole of my suit, a silent, authoritative reminder of her presence. The heat of her touch burned through the fabric, making it impossible for me to focus on anything else Klaus was saying. We wrapped up the conversation within 10 minutes, sealing the verbal agreement with a final shake of hands before Klaus returned to the warmth of the ballroom. The moment the glass doors shut behind him, I immediately stepped away from Victoria, breaking the contact. "Let's be real here, Victoria," I whispered, the adrenaline from her earlier confession still twisting in my stomach. "You bought this company? What kind of sick game are you playing?" Victoria didn't answer me. She simply checked the platinum watch on her wrist, her expression turning into a cold, unreadable mask once more. "The gala is ending," she said quietly. "My car is waiting at the front." "Great. Have a good night," I said, turning toward the main exit, desperate to get away from the suffocating weight of her gaze. "You're coming with me, Elena," Victoria said, her voice dropping to that soft, commanding register that brooked no argument. "I am taking a cab back to Brooklyn," I replied without stopping. "Look outside," Victoria murmured, her voice drifting after me like a tether. "The subway lines are flooded, and the taxi apps have a 2-hour delay. You will get into my car." I stopped at the edge of the ballroom, looking through the massive windows at the chaotic, rain-drenched streets below. She was right. Manhattan was at a complete standstill, red taillights stretching into infinity under the pouring sky. 10 minutes later, I found myself sitting in the leather sanctuary of her private sedan, the heavy door shutting out the roar of the city. The silence inside the vehicle was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic click of the windshield wipers against the glass. Victoria sat on the opposite side of the wide seat, her profile lit by the passing street lamps, her hands resting quietly in her lap. "I meant what I said on the terrace, Elena," she spoke into the darkness, not looking at me. "Don't," I muttered, staring out my window, watching the neon signs of Fifth Avenue blur into long streaks of color. "I spent 5 years in London doing exactly what was expected of me," Victoria continued, her voice soft but carrying a strange, dangerous weight. "I built an empire for my family. I sat in the rooms they wanted me to sit in, and every single night I woke up in an empty bed thinking of you." "Stop it, Victoria," I said, my voice cracking slightly as the walls I had built began to tremble under the assault of her honesty. "I watched your career from across the ocean," she whispered, turning her head toward me, her ice-blue eyes burning in the dim interior. "When the board at Hearst offered the restructuring contract, I bought the majority shares. I dictated the terms. I made sure I was sent here." "Why?" I demanded, turning to face her, the anger exploding out of me. "To torture me? To remind me of what you threw away for a corner office?" "To take back what belongs to me," Victoria said softly. The sheer audacity of the statement left me breathless, my jaw tightening as I stared at the woman who had once broken my heart without a second thought. Before I could fire back a retort, the car slowed to a smooth stop in front of a modern, ultra-luxurious glass high-rise in Tribeca. The driver opened the door, holding a massive black umbrella over us, as Victoria stepped out, her grip instantly locking around my wrist. She didn't lead me to a lobby. She walked straight to a private elevator bank that required a volumetric scan of her palm. "This isn't my apartment, Victoria," I said, trying to pull my hand back, but her grip was like steel disguised as silk. "We need to finalize the formal proposal paperwork for Mercedes tonight so it can be sent to legal first thing Monday," she said, the corporate excuse rolling off her tongue with terrifying ease. The elevator doors opened directly into a massive, minimalist penthouse that occupied the entire top floor of the building. The space was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offering a panoramic, unobstructed view of the Hudson River and the dark, rainy horizon. The air inside smelled exactly like her. Sandalwood, rain, and the faint, expensive scent of polished wood and fresh leather. There were no personal photos, no clutter, no signs of life except for a single familiar item resting on the marble kitchen island. It was a cracked ceramic coffee mug with a chipped handle, the exact mug she had stolen from our Brooklyn apartment 5 years ago. I stared at it, a sudden, heavy thud hitting my ribs as the reality of her obsession sank in. Victoria slid her midnight blue gown off her shoulders, letting the heavy fabric pool at her feet, revealing a sleek, silk slip dress underneath. She walked over to the bars, pouring 2 glasses of dark amber liquid from a crystal decanter without asking. She walked back toward me, barefoot now, her vintage waves falling loosely over her shoulders, the untouchable COO entirely gone. "Drink, Elena," she murmured, holding the glass out to me, her ice-blue eyes fixed on my face with a predatory, desperate focus. "I don't want to drink, Victoria," I said, backing up until my spine pressed against the cold glass of the window overlooking the river. "I want to leave." Victoria set both glasses down on the table next to her, never breaking eye contact as she stepped into my personal space. The physical proximity was overwhelming, the warmth of her skin cutting through the chill of the glass behind me. You can't leave, Victoria whispered, her hands coming up to rest on the window on either side of my head, trapping me just like she had on the terrace. You are locked into this contract, Elena. You are locked into this department, and you are locked into me. Let's be real here, I breathed, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain she could hear it. You left me. You don't get to decide my life anymore. Victoria leaned in closer, her lips hovering just inches from mine, the scent of sandalwood filling my lungs until my brain went entirely numb. I made a mistake 5 years ago, she whispered, her voice cracking with a vulnerability that terrified me far more than her coldness ever could. And I will burn this entire city down before I let you walk away from me a second time. She lowered her head, her breath brushing against my lips, her fingers curling against the glass as she prepared to close the final, agonizing distance between us. Her lips met mine, and the world outside the glass walls evaporated into pure, white noise. It wasn't a tentative reunion, it was a collision of 5 years of unspent fury, buried longing, and toxic pride. Victoria's hands tangled into my messy bob, pulling me against her with a desperate strength that made my breath hitch in my throat. The taste of her was a sharp mix of top-shelf scotch and the ghost of the rain we had both carried inside from the streets. For a single terrifying second, my guarded walls crumbled into absolute dust, and my hands found the bare, warm skin of her shoulders. The familiar curve of her collarbone beneath my fingertips sent a violent tremor straight down my spine, dragging me back to the Brooklyn apartment. But as her tongue traced the lower seam of my lip, demanding a total surrender I wasn't ready to give, a cold hand of reality gripped my heart. The scent of sandalwood and rain wasn't just a memory anymore. It was the smell of the executive suite, the smell of the woman who had threatened my team's livelihood just 12 hours ago. I jammed my palms against her silk-clad chest and pushed her away with every single ounce of strength I had left. Our breathing tore through the silence of the massive penthouse, ragged and heavy, as Victoria stumbled back against the marble counter. Her platinum blonde hair had fallen completely out of its perfect waves, framing eyes that were no longer icy, but wide, dark, and dangerously undone. Let's be real here, Victoria, I choked out, wiping the back of my hand across my mouth, my voice shaking with a mixture of desire and raw disgust. You don't get to do this. You don't get to pull my strings just because you bought the theater. Victoria stared at me, her chest heaving underneath her silk slip dress, her fingers gripping the edge of the marble counter until her knuckles turned white. I am not playing a game with you, Elena, she whispered, her voice rough, stripped entirely of its polished, aristocratic cadence. You think I bought my way into Hearst to manipulate you? Victoria stared at me, her chest heaving underneath her silk slip dress, her fingers gripping the edge of the marble counter until her knuckles turned white. I am not playing a game with you, Elena, she whispered, her voice rough, stripped entirely of its polished, aristocratic cadence. You think I bought my way into Hearst to manipulate you? I did it because it was the only way to tear you out of the obscurity you hid yourself in. Obscurity? I fired back, taking a step toward her, the anger completely eclipsing the lingering heat in my blood. I built a career here. I survived the wreckage you left behind when you crawled into your family's safety net in London. You think London was a safety net? Victoria barked, her calm demeanor fracturing completely for the first time in 5 years. She took a predatory step back into my space, her eyes flashing with a desperate, terrifying intensity. My family would have ruined you, Elena. They were prepared to blacklist your name from every publication on the East Coast just to get me on that plane. I froze, the words hitting me like a physical blow, the air in the room suddenly turning thick and heavy. So you played the martyr, I whispered, a harsh, mocking laugh cutting through my throat. You left a 3-line note on a kitchen counter because you were protecting me. Don't insult my intelligence. I left because if I stayed, I would have destroyed your dream before it even started, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a low, agonizing murmur. She reached out, her fingers hovering just an inch away from my cheek, trembling with a restraint that looked physically painful. But I am the head of the house now. Nobody dictates my terms anymore, especially not who I choose to keep in my life. I am a person, Victoria, not a prize you claim once you've won your corporate war, I said, stepping back, cutting off the potential touch. I have a life. I have a team that depends on me, and I will not be your dirty little secret on the 35th floor. The raw vulnerability in Victoria's face vanished in the blink of an eye, as if a steel shutter had just been slammed down behind her eyes. She blinked once, twice, and the ragged breathing slowed, her shoulders straightening into the rigid, untouchable posture of the COO. She walked over to the wet bars, picked up her glass of scotch, and drained it in one slow, deliberate swallow. When she turned back to me, the woman who had just begged for my forgiveness was gone, replaced by the executioner in silk. "You're right," Victoria said softly, her voice returning to that cool, measured rhythm that always set my teeth on edge. "Personal feelings are an inefficient variable in a corporate structure. Let's return to the data." She walked over to the dining table, picked up a sleek, black leather folder that I hadn't noticed before, and tossed it onto the kitchen island next to my chipped mug. "Open it," she ordered quietly. I walked over slowly, my heart still hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and flipped the cover open. Inside was a non-disclosure amendment and an executive rider attached directly to my employment contract with Hearst Media Group. My eyes scanned the legal jargon, the cold dread returning to my stomach with double the force. "This is a 5-year exclusivity clause," I said, looking up at her, my fingers tightening on the edge of the paper. "If I sign this, my department gets an unrestricted budget guarantee for the next 60 months, I muttered, reading the fine print. "But I cannot resign, I cannot transfer, and I report exclusively to the office of the COO. Every asset must be secured, Elena," Victoria said smoothly, leaning against the counter, her ice blue eyes trapping mine with absolute, unblinking focus. "If you sign it, Marcus keeps his job. Your freelancers get their health packages. Your art is fully funded by my personal shares." "And if I don't?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Victoria offered a cold, beautiful smile that sent a shiver straight down my spine. "Then the Mercedes-Benz contract we secured tonight will be handled entirely by an external marketing agency on Monday morning," she said politely. "And your department will be dissolved due to structural redundancy by the end of the fiscal week." I stared at the document, the pen resting on the black leather folder looking heavier than an iron bars. She had built a cage out of gold, lined it with the safety of the people I cared about, and handed me the key with an ultimatum that left me entirely powerless. "This is extortion, Victoria," I whispered, my voice tight. "This is business, Ms. Vance," she replied softly, stepping closer until her sandalwood scent was once again filling my senses. She picked up the silver fountain pen, holding it out to me, the metal catching the sharp reflection of the lightning outside the window. "The choice is entirely yours. Do you save your art, or do you save yourself from me?" The silver fountain pen felt like a block of solid ice in my hand. I looked down at the signature line on the crisp white paper, my name waiting to be bound to the whim of a single woman for the next 5 years. Victoria stood perfectly still by the kitchen island, her breath coming slow and steady, her ice-blue eyes watching my every movement like a hawk. "Let's be real here, Victoria," I said, my voice barely above a whisper as I brought the nib down to the paper. "You aren't saving my department. You are just buying the rights to my sentence." "I am securing what is essential to the future of this company, Elena," she replied softly, her corporate armor firmly back in place. The dark ink bled into the grain of the paper as I traced the letters of my name, a heavy, suffocating finality settling into the room. I slid the folder back across the marble counter, refusing to look at her as I gathered my tablet and my coat from the leather stool. "The metrics for Mercedes will be on your desk by 8 tomorrow morning," I said, walking toward the private elevator without waiting for her dismissal. Victoria didn't stop me this time. She simply picked up the signed folder, her long fingers stroking the leather cover with a quiet, terrifying satisfaction. The weekend passed in a blurred fog of sleep deprivation and the phantom scent of sandalwood that refused to leave my skin. By Monday morning, the rain had finally cleared, leaving the streets of Manhattan scrubbed clean under a pale, unforgiving July sun. I walked into the Hearst Media Building at 7:30, my chin held high, determined to face my team with the mask of a leader who had won a war. But the moment the elevator doors opened onto the 32nd floor, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. The creative department wasn't buzzing with its usual chaotic morning energy. Instead, groups of designers were huddling near the copy machines, their voices muted and tense. Marcus was waiting inside my glass office, his face entirely drained of color, a stack of Reb-stamped corporate folders clutched tightly in his hands. "Elena, thank God you're here," he whispered, slamming the door shut the moment I stepped inside. "The floor is in a complete panic." "What's happened?" I asked, setting my coffee down, a sudden spike of familiar dread tightening my chest. "Did the Mercedes contract fall through?" "No, the contract is fine," Marcus said, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "It's the board of directors. A full compliance and legal team from the London headquarters arrived at dawn." My heart skipped a violent beat against my ribs, though my face remained completely still. "They've locked down the 35th floor," Marcus continued, leaning in close. "They are auditing every single executive transaction made in the last 48 hours, specifically looking at our budget approval." Before I could ask another question, the landline on my desk let out a sharp, commanding ring that sounded like an alarm. I picked up the receiver, my fingers gripping the plastic until my knuckles turned white. "Elena Vance?" "Ms. Vance, this is Arthur Vance's office." The secretary's voice was entirely devoid of its usual warmth. "You are required in the main boardroom immediately for an emergency session with the Compliance Committee." "Understood," I said, hanging up the phone slowly, staring at the flashing cursor on my laptop screen. "Elena?" Marcus asked, his hand reaching out to touch my arm. "What's going on? Are they going to dissolve us anyway?" "Stay here, Marcus," I ordered, smoothing down the lapels of my blazer. "Keep the team focused. I am going to handle this." The ride up to the 35th floor felt like ascending a scaffold, the silence inside the metallic car thick enough to choke on. When the doors opened, the executive floor looked like a crime scene, with corporate lawyers in identical dark suits moving briskly down the carpeted hallways. The heavy double doors of the boardroom were wide open, and the long mahogany table was surrounded by the entire board of directors, their faces grim and unyielding. Arthur Vance sat at the center, flanked by two senior legal partners from the London firm that represented Victoria's family estate. Victoria was standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, surrounded by 3 compliance officers, her posture as rigid as a marble statue. She had returned to her charcoal suit, her platinum blonde hair pulled into that flawless, untouchable bun, but her sharp jawline was tighter than I had ever seen it. "Ah, Ms. Vance, please step inside," Arthur said, gesturing toward an empty chair at the foot of the table, "and close the doors behind you." I walked in, the click of my heels echoing off the wood paneling, and shut the heavy doors, locking the chaos of the hallway outside. "We are conducting a formal internal review regarding a severe breach of corporate governance," Arthur began, his voice booming with absolute authority. "It has come to the board's attention that an irregular, highly suspicious 5-year budget rider was attached to your department's contract on Friday night." I kept my eyes locked on Arthur, refusing to look at Victoria, though I could feel her ice-blue gaze burning into the side of my face. "The rider guarantees an unrestricted funding pool derived directly from the Chief Operating Officer's personal corporate shares," Arthur continued, tossing a copy of the document I had signed onto the table. "This is a massive conflict of interest, Ms. Vance. The Compliance Committee views this as a blatant use of corporate machinery for personal asset concealment and unauthorized favoritism." "The budget was restructured to secure the Mercedes-Benz account, Mr. Vance," I said, keeping my tone perfectly corporate and steady. "Don't play naive with us, Elena," one of the London lawyers snapped, his eyes narrowing behind his gold-rimmed glasses. "We received an anonymous internal leak this morning containing personal records from 5 years ago. We know exactly who Victoria Sterling was to you before she went to London." The words hit the room like a physical explosion, the silence that followed turning absolutely deafening. "The board's position is clear," Arthur said, leaning forward, his expression hard. "Ms. Sterling has used her new executive power to execute a personal vendetta or an unauthorized romantic arrangement using the company's financial infrastructure. This is grounds for immediate termination for gross misconduct, forfeiture of her majority shares, and a permanent corporate blacklist," the lawyer added coldly. I finally turned my head to look at Victoria, my heart fracturing at the sight of her expression. She wasn't looking at the lawyers. She was looking at me, her ice-blue eyes wide with a rare, desperate vulnerability, a silent plea hanging in the space between us. She'd had built a golden cage to trap me, but in her arrogance, she had walked straight into a trap designed by her own family's enemies to destroy her career forever. "However," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a lower, calculating register that caught my attention, "the board recognizes that you may have been a victim of executive coercion, Ms. Vance." He slid a fresh document across the mahogany table toward me, a silver pen resting neatly on top of it. "If you sign this affidavit stating that Ms. Sterling used undue corporate pressure, intimidation, and threats against your staff to force you into this arrangement, we will grant you full immunity. Your department's budget will be fully absorbed by the central fund. Marcus keeps his job, and Victoria Sterling will be removed from this building by noon," the lawyer explained smoothly. I stared at the affidavit, the black text blurring before my eyes as the terrifying reality of the choice crystallized in my mind. If I signed it, I would be completely free of her forever. The golden cage would shatter, my team would be safe, and Victoria would be ruined, driven out of the city she had called back to conquer. But if I refused, if I stood up and defended the woman who had abandoned me 5 years ago, I would be admitting to a massive corporate scandal, dragging my own name into the dirt, and binding my fate to her sinking ship forever. "We need your formal statement, Ms. Vance," Arthur said, his hand gesturing toward the pen. "The hearing committee is waiting in the next room. What is your answer?" I reached out, my fingers wrapping around the silver pen, my heart tearing itself to pieces in the dead silence of the room. The heavy gold-rimmed glasses of the London lawyer reflected the sterile fluorescent lights of the boardroom, waiting for my hand to move. I looked at the silver pen resting on the affidavit, its polished surface catching a sharp gleam that felt entirely too cold against my fingertips. Across the mahogany table, Victoria stood perfectly still, her ice-blue eyes fixed on me with an intensity that seemed to stop the very rotation of the earth. For 5 years, I had convinced myself that I hated her, that her ambition was a disease that had destroyed the only real thing I ever owned. But looking at her now, facing the wolves of her own creation, I realized that a golden cage is still a cage, no matter who holds the key. I slowly let go of the pen, letting it roll across the mahogany table until it clicked against the wooden edge. "Let's be real here, Arthur," I said, my voice cutting through the dead silence of the room with a calm, terrifying precision. "This affidavit is a work of fiction." Arthur Vance frowned, his thick eyebrows knitting together as he leaned forward. "Ms. Vance, need I remind you that your entire career— My career is built on metrics, not corporate paranoia," I interrupted, standing up slowly and smoothing down the front of my tailored black suit. I pulled my tablet from my leather portfolio and slid a fresh document onto the center of the table, directly over the unsigned affidavit. "This is the formal term sheet finalized by Klaus Reinhardt's legal team less than 2 hours ago," I announced, looking each board member dead in the eye. "The Mercedes-Benz account is the largest digital contract Hearst Media has secured in the last 7 fiscal quarters, valued at $42 million. The London lawyers immediately reached for the document, their eyes scanning the financial columns with a sudden, tense urgency. "If you read Clause 14, I continued, a cold, beautiful confidence settling into my chest, Mr. Reinhardt explicitly states that the contract is contingent upon the current creative leadership remaining intact. Furthermore," I added, turning my gaze directly to the Compliance Committee, "the 5-year budget rider signed by Ms. Sterling wasn't coercion. It was a high-risk, high-return corporate strategy. She used her personal shares to guarantee our creative assets because she knew it was the only way to lock down Mercedes before our competitors did." The boardroom descended into a sudden, chaotic murmur, the legal trap the board had meticulously set for Victoria evaporating into thin air. There was no intimidation, no abuse of power, and certainly no inappropriate workplace relationship, I said, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "It was a brilliant piece of business, and if you fire her today, you lose the Mercedes attached by noon tomorrow." Victoria's jaw remained tight, but the wild, desperate vulnerability in her ice-blue eyes slowly transformed into something else, a deep, burning pride that made my pulse hitch. Arthur Vance stared at the Mercedes term shirt, his face turning a dark, frustrated shade of red before he looked up at the compliance officers. The legal basis for her termination had completely crumbled. Without my testimony as the victim, they had nothing but an anonymous rumor and a highly profitable contract. "It seems," Victoria spoke up for the first time, her voice dropping to that soft, commanding register that instantly took control of the room, "that the compliance review is concluded." She walked away from the window, her tall frame moving with that effortless, regal elegance that had once made me lose my mind. "I suggest the board focuses on preparing the press release for the Mercedes partnership," she added coldly, her gaze sweeping over the defeated lawyers. "Good morning, gentlemen." I didn't wait for the board to dismiss me. I turned on my heel and walked out of the double doors, the adrenaline finally washing out of my veins, leaving me entirely hollowed out. By 9 o'clock that evening, the storm had completely left Manhattan, leaving a clear, starless night sky over the towering monoliths of Midtown. The 32nd floor was entirely dark and silent, my creative team having gone home hours ago to celebrate the survival of our department. I sat at my desk, my tortoiseshell glasses resting next to a cold cup of coffee, staring out at the shimmering yellow lights of the city. The soft chime of the executive elevator broke the silence of the empty floor, followed by the steady, unhurried click of heels against the terrazzo. I didn't turn around when the glass door of my office slid open, the unmistakable scent of sandalwood and rain immediately filling the small room. Victoria stopped right behind my chair, the heat of her presence cutting through the chill of the air conditioning. "You could have ruined me, Elena," she whispered, her voice rough and entirely stripped of its corporate armor. "You had the match in your hand." I turned my chair around slowly, looking up at the woman who had spent half a decade running from the ghost of our past. "I didn't do it for you, Victoria," I said quietly, though we both knew it was the biggest lie I had ever told. "I did it for my team." Victoria slowly sank to her knees in front of my chair, her midnight blue dress pooling around her on the carpeted floor, bringing her face level with mine. She reached out, her long, manicured fingers trembling slightly as she gently took off my tortoiseshell glasses, setting them on the desk. Without the lenses between us, her ice-blue eyes were completely exposed, swirling with a fierce, possessive love that had never truly gone cold. "You're a terrible liar, creative director," she murmured, her forehead coming forward to rest against my knee, her shoulders losing their rigid, untouchable posture. I looked down at her blonde waves, a sudden, heavy sob catching in my throat as the last remnants of my anger finally dissolved into the dark. I reached out, my fingers tangling into her soft hair, pulling her up until she was sitting on the edge of my desk, her hands wrapping tightly around my waist. 5 years, Victoria, I whispered against her lips, the physical proximity turning into a sudden, overwhelming wave of mutual surrender. 5 years of absolute hell. I am never letting you go again, she breathed, her lips closing the final, agonizing distance between us with a tenderness that felt like a healing wound. The kiss wasn't a battle for control or a corporate negotiation. It was an entry into a bond that had been sealed in ink and blood. Her hands pressed against my back, pulling me out of the chair until I was standing between her knees, my arms locked around her neck as if she were the only anchor left in the world. The gold cage she had built wasn't a prison anymore. It was a fortress, and we were both locked inside it together. When she finally pulled away, her ice-blue eyes were dark and heavy with a quiet, peaceful satisfaction that I hadn't seen since we were 22. She reached over, picking up the sleek silver fountain pen from my desk, and slid it into the breast pocket of my oversized blazer. "Tomorrow morning the restructure begins, Elena," Victoria whispered, a small, beautiful smile touching the corner of her lips. "And the board will watch us dance." I leaned in, brushing my lips against the sharp line of her jaw, a dry, genuine laugh escaping my chest. "Let's be real here, boss," I murmured into the dark room. "They won't just watch, they'll have to pay for the tickets." Sometimes the person you spend years trying to forget is the only one who can truly set you free. Thank you for experiencing Elena and Victoria's journey with me. I'd love to know how far their story traveled. Drop a comment below and tell me, where in the world are you listening from today?